Are you like the millions of people who look at these two images and think,
They're the same picture.
or, like me, have you always felt that they were different but couldn't quite put your finger on why? Well, after extensive investigation, I can officially declare that they are in fact different. And if you stick around, I can tell you why. Hi, I'm Burke. Welcome to devlog number 5, where I break down the styles of Rivals and Overwatch on my quest to develop my own. A couple of videos ago, I had a revelation. If AI can produce pleasing images so easily, then maybe creating art is just a matter of following a simple artistic formula. So let's use the elements of art to compare these two hero shooters. We'll look at line, shape, form, space, value, texture, and color. And for simplicity, I'm going to split them into two groups, forms and rendering. Since I'm building a 3D game, line, shape, and form will all be in the context of a 3D world. So forms I think is appropriate. Value, texture, and color are all going to be handled by the rendering engine, so that group makes sense to me. And space will kind of float between the two, but honestly I don't talk about it too much in this video. So if you're here for space, I'm sorry. So going forward in this breakdown, I'm going to be using the Overwatch 1 designs rather than the Overwatch 2 designs. As artists, words like good and bad and I like and I don't like are totally useless to us. Our job, first and foremost, is to communicate. I've been in multiple situations where the thing that I didn't like was actually the best for the job because it communicated the idea more clearly. That said, I don't feel these designs are better or worse, they just lack the distinct shapes the first Overwatch designs had. And to me, they don't really push the Overwatch style forward, just adjacent. Except for Reinhardt. His first design feels sharp, threatening, and deliberate. And they kind of turned him into a teddy bear with these rounded shapes. Reminds me of how I felt when Ford told us they were going to give us this. And then we got this. To me, this modern version feels timid and understated, and I was really hoping for the boldness and the conviction of the original design. So with my preference explained and a minor critique out of the way, I want to turn to a poem by Teddy Roosevelt to remind us the difference between the critic and the man in the arena. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes up short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming. But who does actually strive and do the deeds, who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at best knows the triumph of high achievement, and at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. Alright, so now that I put myself in my place, let's get into it. Every element in both of these games is going to serve the greater message. So what are these games trying to express? For Overwatch, it's the idea of an optimistic future. And for Rivals, they're trying to convey a dynamic comic style. I'm doing this breakdown in the context of developing my own style, so I'm going to start with Anatomic Proportions because I feel like in these semi-realistic hero shooters, those are fairly locked. Meet Andrew Loomis. At least I think this is Andrew Loomis. This is the only picture of an oldish looking dude I could find when I was searching for a portrait of Andrew Loomis, so let's just say it's him. Anyway, if you've tried to learn character art at all, you've definitely heard of him. He wrote some super valuable books, and in one of them, he goes through the anatomic proportions that have been used by artists through the ages. These proportions are based on head height. I'm not going to go into more detail, but if you're interested, and you should be interested, there are dozens of videos on this topic on YouTube, but Procos have been my go-to since I started learning anatomy in 2014, so I highly recommend you look at his channel. Keep in mind that proportions are not the same as scale. We're talking about the size of their anatomy compared to themselves. We can have a character with heroic proportions that's only 2 feet tall, and we can also have a character with childlike proportions that's a giant, as we'll see later. We're talking about hero shooters, so let's ditch the normal proportions because I doubt any of them will use those, but we may have some idealistic proportions, so he can stay. All right, let's start with our resident gunslinger. There is a little bit of perspective, so we're going to have to eyeball it best we can. I'm assuming he's going to fit into the fashion proportions because he's kind of a more normalized archetype, and he does. So I'm going to assume that the more average males in Overwatch fit into these fashion proportions. Just to verify, let's check someone like Bap and Hanzo. Now, let's see what their massive characters are. I'm assuming probably close to heroic, so let's check. Sure enough, Reinhardt fits into the heroic proportions fairly well. Sigma as well. Now let's look at Roadhog. Okay, here's something interesting. So for Roadhog, if we look at his actual head, he fits into heroic proportions. But if we consider his mask, which is a huge part of his read, he's actually something more like 6 heads high, which is a more childish, kind of goofy character proportion. Something more like, oh yeah, Junkrat fits into it, and Torbjorn. Okay, so it looks like the males have about 3 archetypes in Overwatch. We've got fashion for the average males, heroic for the massive males, and then for our more goofy characters, we're looking at a childlike 6 head height. Now, just for fun, I checked what D.Va's mech was. It kind of fits into the heroic proportions as well. Look at where the hips and the shoulders and elbows line up. Something that I took away from this is proportions are super powerful. I mean, we can ignore them, but I feel like we're going to get a pleasing design way faster if we just follow these rules. Speaking of D.Va, let's take a look at the rest of the Overwatch girls. So I started with the fashion proportions because I wanted to see how they compared to the guys, and sure enough, they fit into the fashion proportions, but their pelvises are lifted about a head. And this is true for all of the Overwatch girls. Well, I think. Well, there you go. Now you know how to make pretty Overwatch style girls. And I'm not saying this is bad. Just look at the variety they were able to create based on this one proportional rule. What I am saying is there's no excuse for moments when you're trying to eliminate Invisible Woman and she turns into Cloak and blinds you. Speaking of, let's take a look at the Rivals girls. We'll start with Emma Frost. When I was checking these proportions, I noticed something interesting. She actually fits pretty well within the fashion proportions, but if we include her heels, then it lifts her pelvis just like the Overwatch girls. It begs a question, do heels count as part of a read? And in a hero shooter where they're always wearing these outfits, I think that it does. Most rival girls are wearing heels, but it doesn't always have the same effect. If we look at Black Widow, her heels actually lift her pelvis to something more normal. And I've noticed this is a trend in Rivals where they play with torso length quite a bit. Let's talk about the Hulk. Whoa. Okay, Hulk, you are the most heroic. Now, if we draw these lines out, he does fit into the heroic proportions, but look how low his pelvis drops. And with that low pelvis, he still fits in where the knees and the elbows and shoulders all fit. So this is interesting information to bring back into my character design, that there seems to be a lot of room to play in the torso area. The rest of the rival characters all fit into the proportions that we've already talked about, except for Jeff. This is great information. As I move forward designing my character, there's only a few archetypes that I have to consider when working out his proportions vertically, but there is more room to play horizontally, so let's take a look at that next. At the narrowest end, we've got Invisible Woman at just about 1.5 heads, and at the extreme end on the other side, we've got Monster Hulk, who's just over 4 heads wide. These minimum and maximum proportions do sync up with the way that Overwatch handles their width as well. So we've gathered another limitation. I've got between 1.5 to 4 heads wide to work with. All right, enough about bodies. Let's talk about faces. We're going to use another one of Loomis's charts. This one is based on the most important feature of the face, the eye. Before I did these tests, just looking at the faces, my impression was that Overwatch went for bigger eyes and slightly more exaggerated facial proportions as a way to communicate an optimistic future. Where Rivals, on the other side, seemed to push their eyes a little bit smaller to match the comic references that they were working with for their dynamic comic style. So I dropped in my charts and started to check the proportions. I was encouraged to find out that my eye was right. The Rivals character's eyes were smaller and incidentally pushed out a little further, and the Overwatch character's eyes were bigger and a lot of their features were more exaggerated. Does it make me a villain if this kept running through my head?
I love it when I win.
The Hulk presents an interesting point. In the chin and cranium area, there's the most room for playing with facial proportions, as well as some in the zygomatic bone area. We can look at Hulk and Widowmaker as 2 extremes of facial exaggeration. All right, that ends the anatomy part of the breakdown. Let's look at how proportion plays out in other areas of the costume designs. In this section, I'm not going to focus so much on specific motifs like the techie shapes in Overwatch or the emphasis on energy in Rivals. I'm going to focus more on the abstract treatment of shapes and lines. When it comes to the general proportional relationships of these 2 games, Overwatch's proportions seem to be more narrow, and Rivals seems to be a bit wider. To help me explain what I mean, here's some images created by Neil Blevins for his lesson on primary, secondary, and tertiary shapes. Having a more narrow proportional relationship, like on the right, means that things get smaller a lot slower than having a higher proportional relationship, like on the left, where things get small very quickly. So your details are much finer than in a wider proportional relationship. If you are at all interested in this type of technical understanding of design principles, do yourself a favor and go to his website or his YouTube. The information he provides is incredible. The way that this plays out is in Overwatch, details like zippers and folds that are normally small are really blown up, and armor pads are super thick. Because of this, Overwatch's silhouettes can be pushed further. Things like armor pads and sleeves really break out. The fact that the human body is generally a rectangle and the restriction of smaller details contributes to the rectangular feel of the Rivals characters. That and these massive wrists and ankles. This leads to Overwatch silhouettes being more interesting and dynamic. Some of you are thinking, I thought Rivals style was described as dynamic. What's going on here? And you have every right to be outraged. But let me explain myself. Dynamics definition, according to dictionary.com, characterized by constant change, activity, or progress. So what I'm saying here is that in regards to the silhouette, just the character's outline, Overwatch has greater dynamism because the shapes have bigger changes from small to large. Where Rivals gets dynamic is in their secondary reads, the shapes within the silhouette, and especially their texturing, which I'm really excited to get to. This was probably an intentional move because if everything was dynamic, it would have been very difficult to get a clear read. A simple base makes more room to play with the elements that decorate it. So let's take a closer look at what I mean and wrap up our conversation about forms. Overwatch's interpretation of an optimistic future is generally going to have simpler shapes and fewer and cleaner lines. For Rivals' dynamic comic style, the shapes are going to be more complex and there's going to be more breakup in their lines. I don't know for sure, but it seems like this style answers the question, how do we take the gritty comic aesthetic and make it feel fun and vibrant? And if that was a question, I think they crushed the execution. In most cases, I think this is pretty clear, but let's take a look at places where my assessment might get challenged, starting with these spooky girls. Just looking at these two, I thought Scarlet Witch might have the more dynamic silhouette, but look at Moira's silhouette. That thing is crazy. And when we get into shapes, Rivals really goes for these type of dynamic shapes that have multiple tails feeding to one point. Lots of energy coming from the direction changes and converging lines. While Moira does have one of the more complicated designs, she follows a typical trend of Overwatch shapes, directing from one point to another. Her lines also follow Overwatch's style, smooth and flowing, and there are typically a couple that lead all the way through the design. Where Scarlet Witch has much more sharp angle changes in her lines that quickly redirect the eye as they travel through the design. So let's go to the opposite end of the spectrum, where Rivals might have a more simple design than Overwatch. Now it's hard to say which silhouette is more dynamic here. There is a really interesting moment that happens at Wolverine's wrist. You can think what you will, but I'm going to give Soldier the win here, mostly because I hate being wrong. Looking at this, you might be saying, Wolverine has simpler shapes.
Look hard.
If you think that shape happened to be there because they were just adding folds, you're just starting to see how fun art really is. Why do you think the shape looks so much like the R in Rivals? The awesome thing about this comparison is we have the exact folds counterpart on Soldier's shoulder. Look at how the Overwatch team handles it. The second fold doesn't double back nearly as quickly, and where the Rivals artist cut it off with a hard seam, the Overwatch team lets it breathe and continue down the arm. Finally, let's talk about the lines in these two characters. So there may be some doubt about the shoulder fold referencing the logo, but in Rivals on Breakdown, they state their two key motifs are energy and crystals. And look at the way they handle the folds of the pants. This is totally intentional because these shapes could easily be repurposed by a VFX artist to create a lightning effect.
I'll show you lightning!
If you have to pause and go watch all 3 seasons of that show right now, I totally understand. The lines of these two characters hold true to their styles. The heavy contrast, hard lines created by the line art shader, and angular shapes create a more staccato rhythm in Wolverine, where Soldier has longer, unbroken lines because of his simple shapes, lower contrast, and softer shadows. For the rendering breakdowns, I think it'll be best to handle each game separately. So let's start with Overwatch. Overwatch handles their rendering in a pretty straightforward manner, using physically based rendering, or PBR. This topic could easily balloon the scope of this video. So for those who don't know, PBR is a system for rendering that calculates how objects respond to light based on real-world equations. So materials behave more or less how they would in the real world, giving epic results with little technical effort from the artists. Because fully responsive lighting would melt weaker machines and make the world visually confusing, lighting is baked into the characters. Stage lighting is applied to all of the characters in Overwatch, which is a top-down gradient to clarify the read in darker areas of the map. And contrast is pushed in the ambient occlusion map to make the character's design more clear. The physically accurate lighting also helps the forms appear more round. Texture is added to amplify realism, making the outfits feel used. And the classic Blizzard chipping and wear helps to further clarify the read of the forms. For an epic breakdown of these concepts, check out the talk by Blizzard artist Rake and Kamash. It's linked in the description. Now, let's talk about color. Each hero in Overwatch has up to 3 vibrant colors that define their base skin. These bold colors can blend into one another, but saturated hues will never blend into desaturated hues. Here you can see instead of tinting darker or lighter, they actually use warm and cool tones to push the read of the forms. May's glove and Orisa's, well, all over. Where Overwatch pushes the depth of their forms to increase the feeling of an optimistic future, Rivals, in seeking to create the flatness of comics, does everything they can to remove the subtle gradient transitions and emphasize flatness in their dynamic comic style. As you can see on these two characters, the places you would expect to see smooth transitions, there are solid colors flattening them out. They said they did this to help clarify the read of the characters by making hard distinctions between light and dark areas. In the hero selection screen, they add a blown out rim light and flat chromatic aberration colors to push the flat read. In-game, they do retain that flat rim light, but it is very toned down. Those of you with keen eyes are saying, yeah, but some of those highlights do have a soft gradation. And this is where it gets really interesting. Rivals does use a mix of PBR and hand-painted rendering, but through some tech art sorcery that they describe briefly in their art breakdown videos, they have deliberately limited the amount and range of that light, and even controlled its color in a really dynamic way. In this example, they are only adjusting the hue of a single color parameter in the shader, and it's changing the hue of the highlights in the eyes and on the tip of the nose, which are nearly exact opposite in color. Which brings me to the next element of the dynamic comic style. When looking at these characters, have you ever thought to yourself, why does everything look so metallic? If you have, then you have a good sense for materiality. If we go back to the last image in the brief PBR description, there's a graphic showing metalness. When non-metals are lit, they reflect back the light's color, which desaturates the surface color. But when metals reflect light, they actually reflect back their own color. So the reason that these feel metallic is because the Rivals art team made a conscious decision to retain that color in the highlights, making these colors really jump out. And unlike Overwatch, where they blend their saturated colors, they never do, but they do add small notes of both warmer and cooler tones to really make that base color pop out even more. This creates that ultra vibrant feel of the dynamic comic style. And this is where I think Rivals has the most to offer. If you enjoy the Rivals art style, download the game and take some time to look at all the notes of color they add to their characters. This art style is truly a masterpiece. Now look again at these two images and see if you can spot those contrasting tones. Lastly, since there's so much information in the brushstrokes of the Rivals style, they don't typically add wear, but they do increase the comic book feel with duotone-esque dots and strokes that suggest cross-hatched comic book shading. This was such an epic journey, and even though I failed to hit my goal of getting 2 color comps for my character, I think that it was time very well spent. Overwatch pushed the hero shooter genre forward with incredible iconic characters and a bright, fun art style. Rivals has taken another bounding leap forward with longer team fights and a lot for us artists to absorb and ponder as we try to leave our own mark in video game history. Armed with and inspired by the knowledge that I've gained from studying these two giants, I'm excited to build my own little game to learn and grow, and who knows, maybe work on a game with an incredible team that gets to push the genre forward. See you guys next week with some color comps.